The enemy did not come for your house because of chaos. He did not attack your home because of coincidence. He came because there is purpose living under your roof. There is destiny sleeping in your rooms. There is a calling breathing inside your family line. What you have experienced was not just arguments, misunderstandings, sudden distance, emotional coldness, or repeated conflict. It was an intentional assignment meant to fracture what God was building through you. The enemy knows something many people overlook. When a home stands in unity, heaven moves with power. So he studies homes. He watches marriages. He listens to conversations. He waits for moments of weakness, exhaustion, silence, and unhealed wounds. And then he strikes, not loudly but subtly, not all at once but piece by piece. God says the reason the pressure increased inside your home is because the purpose attached to your life reached a dangerous level for the enemy. You were not just surviving anymore, you were becoming. You were not just believing, you were aligning. And when alignment happens, resistance always follows. The enemy's strategy has always been the same: divide what he cannot destroy. He knows if he can disrupt your peace at home, he can delay your focus. If he can exhaust you emotionally, he can weaken your spiritual strength. If he can keep you fighting internally, you will have no energy left to fight externally. That is why the attack felt personal. That is why it felt unfair. That is why it hurt deeper than usual. God says there were moments you questioned yourself. You wondered if you were the problem. You replayed conversations in your mind. You carried guilt that was never yours to carry. You tried to fix everything alone while silently breaking inside. But hear this clearly: the weight you felt was never meant to crush you. It was meant to reveal what was hidden. The enemy overplayed his hand. What was sent to break your home has exposed the assignment against your purpose, and exposure always comes before deliverance. There is a reason the attacks came when you were close to change. There is a reason confusion entered when clarity was near. There is a reason misunderstandings multiplied when progress was about to accelerate. God says the enemy sensed movement in the spirit before you did. He noticed doors beginning to open. He recognized favor starting to follow you. And because he could not stop what God was releasing over your life, he tried to sabotage the environment where that purpose was being nurtured. Your home. Understand this. A home is not just walls and rooms. It is an altar. It is a spiritual covering. It is the place where faith is either strengthened or slowly drained. The enemy does not need to destroy the whole structure if he can, poison the atmosphere. So he sends irritation. He sends offense. He sends misunderstanding. He sends silence. He sends distraction. And if those things remain unchecked, they begin to feel normal. But God says, what felt normal was never meant to stay. You have been stronger than you realize. The fact that you are still standing proves the attack failed. The fact that you are still praying, even quietly, means heaven is still listening. The enemy wanted you bitter, but you chose endurance. He wanted you broken, but you chose restraint. He wanted you to walk away, but something inside you refused to let go. That something was not weakness. It was purpose protecting itself. God says your home is not cursed. It is contested. And there is a difference. Cursed things decay without resistance. Contested things are fought over because they hold value. The enemy does not fight empty houses. He fights homes where prayer has been whispered through tears. Homes where faith has survived disappointment. Homes where love still exists, even when it is tired. That is why the pressure came in waves. That is why peace felt interrupted again and again. The enemy was hoping persistence would accomplish what force could not. But God says this season is turning, not because everything suddenly becomes easy, but because clarity is returning. You are beginning to see what was really happening. You are starting to separate the people from the pressure, the relationship from the resistance, the home from the attack. And that discernment changes everything. Once you recognize the battle, you stop fighting the wrong enemy. God says restoration does not always begin with apology. It begins with awareness, and you are becoming aware. Aware that not every argument needed to be won. Aware that not every silence meant rejection. Aware that not every storm meant failure. Some storms are proof that growth is happening beneath the surface. Hear this carefully. What the enemy tried to use to fracture your home will become the very testimony that fortifies your purpose. The lessons you learned in pain will protect you in promotion. The endurance you developed in conflict will sustain you in calling. God wastes nothing, not even the nights you cried alone, not even the prayers you whispered when words failed, not even the moments you felt unseen. Heaven recorded all of it. God says your purpose was never fragile. That is why the enemy had to attack indirectly. If your calling were weak, it would have collapsed easily. But it didn't. It endured pressure. It survived tension. It remained intact even when the environment turned hostile. That is proof of divine reinforcement. Now God is calling you to stand differently, not defensive but discerning, not angry but anchored, not reactive but rooted. The season of confusion is lifting, and the season of rebuilding with wisdom is beginning. What you rebuild now will be stronger than what existed before, because it will be built with understanding, boundaries, and spiritual authority. This is not the end of your story. This is the turning point. The enemy tried to stop your purpose by breaking your home, but God is about to show you that purpose does not break, it rises. And what rises after? Resistance carries power that cannot be shaken. The enemy believed that if he could keep pressure inside your home long enough, you would eventually surrender your assignment. He assumed fatigue would silence your prayers. He assumed emotional distance would cancel your faith. He assumed that repeated conflict would convince you that peace was no longer possible. But God says the enemy misunderstood one critical thing about you. You were never sustained by comfort. You were sustained by calling. Even when strength felt gone, purpose kept you breathing. Even when hope felt thin, obedience kept you standing. There were moments when you felt like giving up would be easier than holding on. Moments when silence felt safer than speaking truth. Moments when withdrawing felt like the only way to survive. God says those moments were not signs of weakness. They were signs of warfare. The enemy wanted isolation because isolation weakens perspective. He wanted you to feel alone even when surrounded, tired even when resting, distant even when close. That is how spiritual pressure works. It distorts reality until you forget who you are and why you were chosen. But God says you were never chosen randomly. Your family line carries something the enemy fears. There is a pattern of resilience, a history of endurance, a spiritual inheritance that refuses to die. Even if you did not grow up hearing prayers, you became the prayer. Even if peace was not modeled for you, you became the peacemaker. Even if stability was absent before, you became the foundation. That shift alone marked you as a threat to darkness. The enemy attacks homes because homes are where identity is shaped. If he can confuse identity early, he can delay purpose later. If he can damage trust, he can distort love. If he can replace safety with fear, he can influence generations. But God says what the enemy intended for long-term damage will result in generational healing. What you confront now ends cycles others had to endure silently. You did not imagine the resistance. You did not exaggerate the heaviness. You did not misunderstand the intensity. God says the assignment against your home was real, but it was limited. The enemy was permitted to test, but not to destroy. He was allowed to shake, but not to remove. And the fact that you are still here proves the limit held. There were prayers you prayed that seemed unanswered, nights when you spoke to God and felt only silence in return. God says silence does not mean absence. Some answers come as endurance, not explanation. Some miracles arrive as strength to last, not storms removed. You were being trained, not punished. You were being refined, not rejected. God says your endurance frustrated the enemy. He expected retaliation, but you chose restraint. He expected bitterness, but you chose patience. He expected surrender, but you chose faith. Even when your faith was quiet, even when it was imperfect, even when it was tired, it was enough. Heaven does not require perfection to move. It responds to persistence. The enemy underestimated what happens when a person refuses to quit. He underestimated the power of someone who stays when walking away would be easier. He underestimated the authority that develops in someone who learns how to pray through pain instead of escaping it. God says authority is not given lightly. It is earned in unseen battles. And you have earned more than you realize. What you endured inside your home has given you discernment you did not have before. You can now sense shifts before they explode. You can recognize tension before it destroys peace. You can identify spiritual pressure without blaming people. That awareness is a weapon, and weapons are given only to those who can be trusted with them. God says the enemy tried to turn your home into a battlefield, but God is turning it into a training ground. What once drained you will now strengthen you. What once confused you will now instruct you. What once hurt you will now position you to help others who face similar storms. Nothing was wasted. Not one tear, not one prayer, not one night of endurance. There is healing happening beneath the surface, even if it is not fully visible yet. Restoration does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, through softened hearts. Through honest conversations, through new boundaries, through wisdom replacing emotion. God says, do not rush the process. What is being rebuilt now must last. The enemy will attempt one final tactic: discouragement. He will whisper that nothing has changed. He will suggest that effort is pointless. He will remind you of past failures. But God says, do not confuse memory with destiny. Your past does not define your future, and your wounds do not cancel your calling. The fact that you can still hope proves the enemy did not win. God says your home will not be known for what it survived, but for what it produces. It will produce peace where there was pressure, wisdom where there was confusion, stability where there was shaking, and purpose where there was pain. This is how God redeems battlefields. He turns them into testimonies. The season ahead requires a different posture. Not survival mode, but stewardship. Not constant defense, but intentional alignment. God says guard your atmosphere, guard your words, guard your peace. What you protect now will multiply later. The enemy looks for open doors, but discernment closes them quietly. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not disqualified. You are right where growth happens. And what is growing inside you cannot be stopped by pressure, opposition, or misunderstanding. God says the enemy tried to break your home to stop your purpose, but instead, your purpose grew roots where it was planted. This is preparation. This is positioning. This is strengthening. And soon, what once felt like constant resistance will feel like release. Not because the enemy disappeared, but because you learned how to stand. God says the storms you experienced inside your home were never meant to define you. They were meant to refine you. Every conflict, every misunderstanding, every moment of emotional distance served a purpose you could not see at the time. The enemy assumed that tension and disruption would weaken your faith, but God allowed it to strengthen your spiritual backbone. You were being equipped, not defeated. You were being trained, not abandoned. What the enemy planned for harm, God is using for good. Think about the way your family responded during those difficult seasons. You may have felt like you were fighting alone, but God was quietly working behind the scenes. He was aligning hearts, softening stubbornness, and opening eyes to truth. Sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that produce the greatest shifts. What you endured was not random. It was intentional preparation for your purpose. Every tear, every sleepless night, every prayer uttered in secrecy contributed to spiritual fortification that the enemy could not anticipate. God says the enemy tried to manipulate fear, but you refused to comply. He wanted isolation to make you doubt your calling. He wanted division to stop the flow of blessings. He wanted silence to convince you that God had forgotten. But you chose to trust despite what you saw. You chose faith over fear. You chose endurance over escape. That choice created a spiritual shield around your home, even when it felt invisible. The enemy was forced to act more aggressively because he could not penetrate what God was protecting. Consider the lessons learned in adversity. You discovered your boundaries. You recognized where influence could become harmful. You learned which relationships required patience and which required distance. You experienced the importance of prayer, discernment, and timing. These lessons were designed to produce leadership qualities in you. God is molding you to be a voice of wisdom and a source of refuge not only for your family but for others who will encounter similar storms. The enemy tried to instill despair in your household, but God instilled hope. He planted seeds of perseverance, courage, and love where there was conflict. He reminded you that what is built with prayer and anchored in faith cannot be shaken by temporary opposition. He showed you that enduring hardship produces resilience, that patience refines character, and that obedience during testing demonstrates readiness for promotion. Your home became the proving ground for spiritual maturity. God says the enemy wanted you distracted, frustrated, and reactive. But what you did instead was deliberate. You cultivated peace where chaos attempted to reign. You created understanding where confusion sought to dwell. You extended grace where bitterness threatened to dominate. This was not accidental. It was strategic alignment with God's purpose. Every action of patience, every step of forgiveness, every decision to remain steadfast contributed to the formation of your spiritual authority. Even when moments of hopelessness crept in, God remained your anchor. He reminded you that your purpose was greater than the storm, your calling bigger than opposition, and your destiny broader than circumstance. He whispered that the attacks on your home were temporary, but the lessons and strength gained would last forever. The enemy underestimated how much growth could occur even when it felt like the situation was collapsing. God says the longer the fight, the greater the testimony. Your home was a battlefield, but also a classroom. You were being taught endurance, discernment, and spiritual leadership. The enemy wanted to weaken your faith through repeated exposure to conflict, but God ensured every trial had a lesson. You learned how to navigate tension without losing peace. You learned how to guard your heart while extending love. You learned how to pray not just for resolution, but for wisdom. These lessons will serve as a foundation for your purpose. God says the attacks were limited by divine protection. No matter how intense, no matter how persistent, the enemy could only go so far. He could shake, but he could not destroy. He could attempt to confuse, but he could not erase what God planted in your family. What was meant to harm you was actually a test of faith. And every time you chose trust, endurance, and obedience, your spiritual authority increased. You were growing stronger, even when the enemy thought you were falling apart. Now God is revealing clarity. What once seemed confusing is now becoming clear. The tactics of the enemy are being exposed. The areas of your home that were vulnerable are being fortified. Hearts are being restored. Communication is improving. Love is being renewed. And the calling over your life is becoming unmistakable. The attacks that were meant to delay you are now becoming indicators of where God's favor is working most powerfully. God says your home is no longer just a place of survival. It is now a place of strategy. It is a center of influence. It is a sanctuary for purpose. What the enemy tried to destroy, God is using to showcase resilience, wisdom, and faithfulness. Your experiences have produced a level of spiritual discernment that will guide you in future battles. You have learned the art of standing firm without reacting, of guarding your atmosphere without controlling others, and of protecting your purpose without compromising love. The enemy will continue to test, but God has empowered you with spiritual insight. You can now identify attacks before they fully manifest. You can recognize when pressure is being applied for a reason. You can respond with wisdom instead of frustration, with patience instead of panic, with faith instead of fear. Your home is being transformed from a place of vulnerability into a stronghold of purpose, influence, and blessing. God says your endurance has set the stage for testimony. The lessons learned in conflict are now tools for leadership. The prayers whispered in private are now launching you into authority. The patience exercised under pressure is now producing spiritual fruit. You are no longer just surviving. You are preparing to lead, to mentor, to impact, and to demonstrate what happens when purpose refuses to be stopped. God says the season of struggle inside your home is not the end. It is the beginning of a testimony that will inspire generations. What the enemy intended for destruction, God is transforming into a platform for blessing, authority, and influence. Every tear you cried, every prayer you whispered in secrecy, every moment of endurance, even when you felt unseen, was recorded in heaven. Your obedience and steadfastness are now creating a spiritual legacy that cannot be erased. The enemy tried to break your home to stop your purpose, but God says your purpose cannot be stopped. The enemy wanted to create division, confusion, and hopelessness, but God says he has underestimated your spiritual resilience. He thought that if he could sow discord among your family, your calling would be delayed. He assumed that emotional fatigue would silence your prayers. He thought that repeated frustration would force resignation. But God says you were built for these moments. Your faith has been tested, refined, and strengthened. What the enemy sent as a weapon, God used as a tool to reveal your hidden strength and authority. God says clarity is returning to your home. The misunderstandings that once clouded judgment are being cleared. The offenses that once felt unbearable are being softened with forgiveness. The hearts that were hardened by pain are now beginning to open to reconciliation. And as these walls of misunderstanding fall, the foundation of your purpose grows stronger. The enemy's attempts to disrupt your destiny are now serving as indicators of where God's favor and intervention are at work. Your home is becoming a place of spiritual strategy. The lessons learned in conflict are teaching you discernment. You are learning to respond instead of react, to guard your heart while extending love, and to maintain peace even in the midst of pressure. God says that every time you chose patience over anger, grace over bitterness, and trust over fear, you fortified a spiritual stronghold that no enemy can penetrate. The experiences that once threatened to derail you are now equipping you for leadership and influence. God says that generational blessings are being released because of your endurance. What you have endured is producing wisdom and authority that will guide not just your household but future generations. The prayers and sacrifices of today are establishing a legacy of faithfulness, resilience, and victory. The enemy may have tried to use your home as a battlefield, but God is turning it into a training ground for spiritual excellence and purpose alignment. Your home will now be known not for the battles it endured, but for the strength, unity, and purpose that emerged from those battles. The enemy may continue to test, but God says you have been equipped with discernment and spiritual insight. You can now recognize attacks before they manifest fully, protect your atmosphere, and respond with wisdom instead of frustration. Your home is no longer vulnerable. It is fortified with prayer, faith, and purpose. The spiritual authority developed through endurance is now being activated, ensuring that what the enemy tried to stop will move forward with unstoppable momentum. God says your family will now experience unity, understanding, and peace that surpasses the challenges of the past. The conflicts that once seemed endless are being replaced with reconciliation and love. The emotional wounds that once seemed permanent are being healed through divine intervention. What was once a place of tension is becoming a sanctuary where purpose can thrive, where faith can grow, and where the destiny of your household is being fulfilled. Every step of endurance has positioned you for divine promotion. Your testimony will now serve as a beacon for others facing similar attacks. What the enemy meant for harm is now becoming evidence of God's protection and guidance. Your experience teaches that purpose cannot be destroyed by external chaos, that faith cannot be silenced by repeated frustration, and that destiny cannot be delayed by temporary opposition. God says the enemy may try again, but his attempts will only highlight the strength, wisdom, and resilience that have been established in your home and your life. God says restoration is not just a return to normalcy, it is a transformation. What emerges from this season is a stronger, wiser, and more strategically aligned household. What the enemy intended to fracture will now demonstrate unity. What he tried to disrupt will now display divine order. What he attempted to stop will now flourish because of God's intervention, your obedience, and your endurance. Your home is now a testimony of victory, resilience, and the unstoppable nature of God's purpose. The enemy tried to break your home to stop your purpose, but God says you will now see the fruit of endurance, prayer, and faithfulness. The walls of opposition are now walls of protection. The storms have become teachers, not destroyers. The pressure has become preparation, not punishment. What you once feared would undo your family is now evidence of God's favor and the manifestation of His plan. Your home is no longer a battlefield. It is a platform for purpose, influence, and legacy. God says the attacks have ended in victory. The lessons learned have created spiritual authority. The prayers whispered in isolation have prepared your family for divine alignment. The endurance displayed has established a foundation for generational blessing. What was meant for disruption has become a testimony of God's protection and guidance. Your home is now fortified, your family aligned, and your purpose unstoppable. The enemy tried, but he failed. God says your purpose will rise higher than ever before, and nothing can stop what heaven has ordained for you.